Hi, welcome to the TIFF Illumination Project. My name is Tom Tresser. I'm the co-founder of the Civic Lab, a space dedicated to innovation, collaboration, and education for social justice and civic engagement. The TIFF Illumination Project is an unprecedented, citizen-driven effort to investigate and explain Chicago's massive tax increment financing, or TIF program, on a ward-by-ward basis. We've done meetings all over the city, but we've decided to produce a series of videos and place them online free of charge so folks anywhere can get illuminated whenever they want. This video was made possible by an Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign, and over 50 donors gave generously to make this possible. Thank you. So this video is TIF 101. We want to break it down for you and explain what a TIF, tax increment financing district, is and how it works and why it matters. We're going to have two distinguished experts lay out their point of views for you. We have Professor Rachel Weber from the University of Illinois at Chicago and Cook County Clerk David Orr. They'll be joining us to give their perspectives on TIFs, and hopefully you will be illuminated. Let's take a look.
My name is Rachel Weber, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois Chicago in the Urban Planning and Policy Department. I also act as an advisor to various nonprofits and local governments, including the Civic Lab. So TIF stands for Tax Increment Financing, and TIF is a financing tool that municipalities like cities and towns use to redevelop areas or particular parcels in cities that they feel are in need of redevelopment. So the way that TIF works is that a municipality will use public dollars, public property tax dollars, to invest in a particular area, a district, and then over time the value of property in that district, let's hope that value will increase, and that value, that incremental difference, the value that was created new since the TIF was designated, is used to pay back those original expenditures. So it works kind of like a credit card. You spend now and you pay it back later on as the increment is generated. In the state of Illinois, and every state is different, the lifespan of a TIF is 23 years, although it can be extended for an additional 12 years after that. So that means that for 23 years, any increase in property value does not go to the general fund of the municipality, but rather goes into a TIF account to be used to pay off spending or to spend down in the area that has been designated as that TIF district. So historically, municipalities in the United States have used different forms of subsidy as an incentive, as a kind of sweetener to attract and retain private businesses or to encourage development in particular locations. So subsidies are not new. TIF is not that new. It's been around since 1955, actually. But municipalities started using it in full force after federal funding for urban redevelopment began to decline. So local governments were hard-pressed to find other monies to use to subsidize development, to either, as I said, attract or retain businesses, or to try to encourage development in particular locations. There's a sense that TIF is used to encourage developers to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, or to go to areas or to redevelop sites that they otherwise would not redevelop. Maybe there's some kind of site-specific impediment. Maybe the area is a brownfield, so it has environmental contamination, or maybe it's an area that's on the fringe of an area that has otherwise been developed, and developers are reluctant to go there. So municipalities try to incent them to try to steer them toward those areas. So in order to designate a TIF district, there are two requirements. A municipality has to find that the area in question is blighted. And blight is a pretty subjective kind of determination, but it's been around in the policy lingo for many, many decades, since urban renewal starting in the 40s and 50s, basically. And so what it means is that every state has a definition of what blight is on a list of what they call blighting factors, things that demonstrate that the area is deteriorated or that property values in the area are not increasing as quickly as they are, let's say, in other places, or there's excessive vacancies, or that the land use mix is obsolete. So there's a long list of these blighting factors, and municipalities have to demonstrate that a certain number of these factors are present in the area in order to designate it as a TIF district. The second requirement for designating a TIF district is what's called the but-for requirement. So the municipality has to attest that the area would not develop on its own, that it would not develop but for the use of tax increment financing. So maybe other forms of incentives would be inadequate, or no subsidy would mean that developers would just ignore that area. So that's, again, a pretty subjective determination, because it's hard to look into the future and say what would have happened if the municipality decided not to designate a TIF district or not to subsidize a particular developer, but it's still something that is on the books as a requirement for TIF designation. So Chicago's been using tax increment financing since the mid-1980s. So TIFs have been around for a while, but they were really used, again, in force. The numbers of TIF districts really shot up in the late 1990s when it got easier to demonstrate that an area was blighted. Currently, we have a little bit over 160 TIF districts in the city of Chicago, and about a third of the area of the city is covered in TIFs. And so that's a pretty high, a large amount of the city is currently underneath these TIF overlays. So the city of Chicago is a very frequent user of this mechanism. Mayors have claimed over the years that there's really no other source of financing that they can use to try to encourage development in particular locations. And so TIF has become the tool of choice for subsidizing redevelopment. So what happens in a TIF district is all of the incremental property tax revenue goes to this TIF account instead of going to the city's general fund. It is also not part of the base for overlapping taxing jurisdictions, such as the school district or the park district or the library district. So there are all these other taxing jurisdictions that rely on the property tax base, but whenever a municipality designates a TIF district, that incremental revenue is suddenly inaccessible to those taxing jurisdictions. So there is concern that school districts and other overlapping taxing jurisdictions are harmed by the use of TIF or the overuse of TIF. In Chicago, that's become less of an issue because there's still a concern, but school districts have not opposed TIFs in the same way that they have, let's say, in suburban municipalities in suburban Cook County and in other states across the country, where it's really the school districts that push back on the municipality's use of TIF. In Chicago, because the school district's controlled by the mayor, we've not seen that kind of pushback. There are other ways of funding public improvements, such as bonds. There are other kinds of financing programs that are available to local governments, other kinds of tax credits. Property tax abatements are another way of funding this, funding the kinds of economic development that local governments often want to see, but those are similarly problematic. I think the bigger question is just whether or not private developers need the TIF in the first place, right? So the area may not develop but for the use of TIF, but do individual developers really deserve these sort of public tax dollars when, for example, private money is readily available, when they can go to a bank and get a good interest rate? Is it really the public sector's role to be subsidizing development at times when private money is available? TIF is a kind of, I would call it a Darwinian type of a economic development program, because it basically means that the areas that are in the best position to increase their property values do the best. They are the ones that get the most developer interest. They're the ones where property values increase at a faster rate so that there's more money to subsidize more development. It's kind of a virtuous cycle. When we look at the city, we see that low-income neighborhoods that have been TIF'd are kind of dormant. There hasn't been a whole lot of market activity. Private developers are less interested in moving there, even with a little bit of TIF funding. And so those areas are really not able to capitalize on this TIF program. And so you see that TIF is generating a lot of money. It's very active in areas typically around and inside the central business district. Whereas if you go out to the neighborhoods, there's a lot less activity in the sort of places where you think that could really use some public investment. If TIF is being used, it may mean that that investment is not forthcoming because this mechanism relies on the private sector, relies on the market to create money in those coffers to invest in the area. It seems these days that we let the tail wag the dog. We let the financial tool determine what urban policy is going to be instead of vice versa. And that is a trend not just in Chicago but across the country. So we allow financial capital, we allow investors to decide what kinds of cities we live in. And we've ceded responsibility to actors who are potentially not even living in the cities where we live and may not have a long-term interest in the improvement in our cities.
My name is David Orr. I'm the Cook County Clerk, and part of my responsibility as County Clerk is to do reports on what we call TIF, tax increment financing. And so over the last few years we've tried to provide more information on this terribly important subject because it affects hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers in Cook County. Now also keep in mind is because like last year the TIF took $422 million in the city of Chicago alone from the property tax system into the TIFs. So that means that $422 million is not going into the schools of Park District, the city. So in a sense, all taxpayers, even if they're not on a TIF, end up helping to pay for that. So the ultimate controversy, besides the lack of accountability, we've had interns, we've had scholars that study this thing over and over again. It's very difficult to really understand when someone diverts 50 million, 70 million, 80 million a year into a particular TIF district, exactly what the money's for, how it's being spent, are there bids on the money that's being spent, etc. There are legal necessities of monitoring, of auditing this, but my conclusion is clear we need a lot more of that, particularly in Chicago. Suburbs have generally less problems because it's easier for suburban areas to highlight something. So whether it's Arlington Heights or Des Plaines or someplace on the south side, suburbanites generally have less of a problem with accountability, but they still can have it. Normally the property taxes that you pay go into several funds, like I said, schools, park district, whatever. So now there's this new thing called the TIF. And if you're in a TIF, it goes into the TIF fund. The municipality defines that. It defines the boundaries. It defines the purposes. It defines what it's supposed to be spent for, okay? And that's where the key stuff comes in. In some cases, it's spent to build schools, to fix roads, to clear off property where it's kind of in bad shape, and to encourage a developer to come in and develop that site. So the municipalities have the responsibility for the operations of that TIF. So it's a separate, separate account that has to be publicly watched and monitored and audited. There's auditing requirements. And so that TIF fund almost becomes like another taxing body. And that's where that money goes. My job as county clerk is to point out how much money goes into each of these TIFs, okay? And that's why it's important. A few years ago, it was about $500 million a year in the city of Chicago alone. Because the economy has gone down somewhat, so last year was about $422 million. The fundamental reason that I think this is important is like aldermen will sit and debate, like in Chicago, how to spend the regular money, the city budget, okay? Do we have enough to help the homeless? What are we doing about housing, etc.? But this 422, formerly 500 million, over the years $6 billion, has been spent not totally in secret, but with the public not really understanding it. And so given Chicago faces a serious economic crisis, we all know it. The city of Chicago is going to raise people's taxes a great deal next year, their property taxes. We've already passed on paying the pensions like we should. The school board has avoided paying a lot of money they should. So we know we got trouble in the future. And so when there is this pot of money, there's still $1.6 billion that has been raised, and there's a debate about how all that's going to be spent. But given that's about the only money around anywhere, it's important that the public understand this. And the chief criticism is the vast majority of that $6 billion and remaining of the $1.6 billion is being spent in what we call the downtown area. And so that part of this goal is there's good TIFs, there's bad TIFs, there's accountability, there's not accountability. But when you've got a city lacking in resources and people desperate for poor schools or not enough jobs and need neighborhood investment, and you say to yourself, well, why did they spend this $150 million on State Street? Why did they spend $150 million or more on Michigan Avenue? Why are they doing some of the things they're doing? They don't necessarily get the right answers. And it's not, everyone wants to see the downtown develop. The question is priorities. So when we can put the money in the tax bills, if we can give a report that explains carefully, at least as much as we can, about how the money is being spent, and then critiquing that, the goal is to see if, in this crisis financially, if more of the TIF money could be spent more wisely. And I think the critics, including the authors of this video and some of the progressive aldermen, have been successful in the last few years of demanding mayoral administrations, particularly into Chicago, to understand scrutiny is needed, and because of the scrutiny, we're taking some of that money back. One of the key things about this that people don't understand is something called portability. Now, what portability means is if you draw these TIF districts and they actually touch, which almost all of them in the downtown area do, when they touch, there's kind of a clever ability that the money from one TIF could be spent in another TIF. Now, in theory, you could argue that's good. On the other hand, I certainly believe a lot of this portability is being used back, was it with the Olympics, whatever, the plan for that. They were trying to put a lot of money together. I suspect they're doing the same thing with a possible casino for Chicago. And you can debate the legitimacy of the Olympics or the casino. The problem is this is all being done in secret. I do think historically it's been used in Chicago as a bit of a slush fund. And what that means basically is because of the lack of accountability, the difficulty, and I'm not saying there is some information, it is just very difficult to follow. And if you only have one or two TIFs in your neighborhood and the alderman is real upfront with you, you're going to know what the plans are. You may not be able to find it on paper or to the extent you want, but there's ways to find out. But given this lack of accountability, the larger issue, which means we're not debating as much as we should, is this the best way to spend these hundreds of millions of dollars? Like I say, we have a lot of blighted areas in what we call the neighborhoods, and yet most of the money is spent downtown. That's why I keep raising this issue that we have more serious blight in the neighborhoods than we have downtown. We have, an awful lot of money is being spent downtown, which relieves the business and the corporations from having to pay this money. But is that the fairest way to use this public money to make all of Chicago benefit?
So there you have it, TIF 101. We'd like to thank again Professor Rachel Weber and Cook County Clerk David Orr for sharing their expertise with us. But as you heard them say, there are some problems with Chicago's TIFs. Surprise, surprise. And we'd like to break that down for you in our next video, which we call the TIF Hall of Shame. But in order to do that, we're going to need your help. We need to raise the funds to produce these excellent videos, which we hope to be a series of 5. So please, visit www.tiffreports.com, where you'll find details on how you can get involved so we can produce all 5 videos, as we mentioned, because after all, shouldn't everyone be illuminated? Thanks again for watching.
is Marjorie Tatum, and I am a real estate broker for Keller Williams Realty in Hyde Park. My office actually is in the 4th Ward, and I spend a lot of time in that community. I became interested in the TIF project some years ago, actually, and when I realized that how, frankly, unfair, unjust, and unethical that these funds were being distributed or allocated, I just knew I had to do something about it. It was just so blatantly wrong, it seemed to me, and actually bordering on criminal.